Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Virtual CISO Podcast. As always, I'm John Berry, and with me, as always, the buzz to my Woody, Jeremy Sporn. Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, good morning, Sheriff Woody.
So you had a chance to listen to my conversation with John. What'd you think?
We are talking about your conversation with Jon Bass, right? You're not referring to yourself in the third person again?
Yeah, that's kind of harsh, ain't it? I mean, I'm not going to deny I have a rather inflated opinion of myself, but I don't think I'm guilty of actually referring to myself, in the third party very often.
All right, fair enough. We'll move on from that. I did listen to the conversation. There's this commonality I find with all very technically brilliant people. We have a few of them on our team. When they are communicating with someone that they know is really not on their level. I'm not trying to hurt your ego any more than I already have, but I just think it's fair to say that you guys are on different levels when it comes to this particular topic. Brilliant people choose their words really carefully to keep that conversation approachable for their audience. And I thought Jon Bass did an excellent job of keeping, your far inferior brain into the conversation.
You're really playing this one up, aren't you? So just so you know and guys, stay tuned for next week because we'll have a different co-host on the show. So listen, if you're speaking about DevOps, guilty as charged, I cannot argue with the inferior statement. I mean, that's why he came on to do the podcast and I didn't. The idea behind the podcast was sort of a DevOps for Dummies. And in this case, it was me in the corner with the dunce cap on.
Yeah, at this point, I've probably listened to the conversation you guys have had 3 times, and it is crazy how much I've learned. Application development and application security, in the security world itself is just its own beast. It's got its own terminology. The people who live in there almost breathe differently. And internally now that we are developing our own proprietary tools, and I'm in charge of marketing those. It has been very helpful to listen to how developers think about getting their software out into the world safely, how they look at things like continuous improvement. Really very insightful for someone who's more on the business side of that software development.
Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were chatting there that, we've really put together a number of like really good podcasts for someone who's kind of starting to deal with this. I'm thinking right away like Jim Manico and him talking about the software, the security training for developers, and Andrew Vanderstock and Daniel Cuthbert, right, and providing the OWASP guidance and to developers as well. So we put together some good stuff here, and I think that's especially important because increasingly there's an adage, and it's true, the world runs on software, and a lot of that software is now being deployed in a cloud model using various levels of the DevOps that John and I talked about. So increasingly, DevOps and or SecDevOps, right, are critical to the security and privacy of the data that all these apps are storing, processing, or transiting.
Yeah, it was very interesting to hear that software hardware is now software in many cases, which was something
that's really what DevOps is, right? I mean, in fact, when we were talking about the patents a few minutes ago, what were we talking about? We're talking about the fact that with the click of a button, right, you are deploying servers, applications, databases, routing tables, firewalls. So yeah, software is hardware.
Yep. And Jon Bass, CTO at SimOps, he is the guy that you want to listen to about this. Very experienced engineer that does a great job of explaining that very complex world of DevOps to people who just don't live it every single day. You will definitely walk away with a fresh perspective on software development in today's world, particularly. He also gives a pretty good history lesson, which I appreciated, and which is really built around this idea of aligning business and client objectives with software development, which I just thought was super cool.
Agreed. So with no further ado, let's get on to the show. John, how are you, sir? Thank you for joining us.
I'm great. Glad to be here.
So as we always do, we start easy. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm Jon Bass. I'm the CTO at SimOps. We're a startup based in Boston and San Francisco. We're focused on helping companies build security and compliance workflows with automation that is perfectly matched to their environment. Our approach is really to create a developer-focused, engineer-focused toolkit that lets teams kind of take our templates and build workflows that don't just mostly match, but kind of exactly match the use cases of each organization that we service.
Cool. And before we get down to business, I always like to ask, what's your drink of choice?
Yeah, you let me know about this. I was thinking about it, and I do.
You have to think about it, then it's not your drink of choice. I mean, if you don't, if it just doesn't resonate, then come on.
Thing is, like the examples, like, so I was trying to think, like, the truth is my drink of choice is coffee. So my drink
nothing wrong with that.
But like, I wanted to give something a little bit more fun, but the reality is it's coffee. Anyone who's worked with me knows that like I'm continually getting coffee, making coffee. And now that I'm home, I've got a nice espresso maker, and that's part of my morning ritual. And now it's also to the point where, like, if I don't make the espressos for, I don't make espresso for my wife, I get in trouble. So like it's part of what keeps me here.
So whenever I talk with espresso people, it's always, there's the question: Are you a Lavaz person or what's the other major one? There's two camps on espressos.
Oh man, well I have been buying beans from this place in Brookline for years now. I just get, I'm not sure. I just buy my beans there, and I even if I'm when we were just on vacation, and I mail ordered beans from them to where we were on vacation.
I guess you like their beans. All right, so let's get down to business. So obviously from your intro, somebody might understand why we asked you to be on this podcast, which we're loosely calling podcast, DevOps for Dummies, because it's amazing to me how DevOps has moved from something which was, N years ago, where N is a relatively short number, something sort of fringe and a buzzword or something you heard, to front and center. So what is DevOps, and why did it move from being fringe to center?
Yeah, I mean, DevOps has come to mean a lot of different things. I think it's almost now to the point where DevOps really can mean anything from almost like classic system administration to people doing like sophisticated cloud architecture. I think probably if you had to say what is the ingredient where people feel like something is DevOps, it's when there feels like there's more of a coding or an engineering bent to kind of operational activities. So whereas maybe in a traditional IT or software organization, you had kind of ops people and they had their practices, and you had engineers and they had their practices, and they were kind of two different worlds. Like literally, as the name implies, DevOps, what happened was a confluence of factors, both technical, cultural, that like led to kind of the some of the practices that engineering teams use to manage their software and applications, kind of moving down the stack and over in the stack to kind of operational practices as well.
So let's kind of simple. Let's take that down or take it up a level, whichever way you look at it. Yeah. Like for like a business person that's listening to this, right? And I'll give you one example of where I was confused by DevOps, and why I almost feel like from not a guy that's as experienced as you, I almost thought it should be called DevOps. Because what I used to think DevOps was the combination of development, like traditional development, and operations. And it was for a while I didn't realize that DevOps was really the integration of development methodologies into the operations component that supported the development that we've always been talking about, right? The actual coding, right? So like if you think about like the whole set of pieces of this, right? We still have the conventional application development, right? Let's say we're talking about a SaaS. You still got the guys that are developing the code that's the underlying application. Then you've got the guys that are developing the scripts and code that are responsible for the operational components of deploying and managing that stuff, right? Was that said reasonably well? Can you clean up what I said?
I mean, no, I think what you said was great. I think for me, you know, when I really started to get excited about DevOps, and I think a lot of people that were early in DevOps kind of got bummed out when they started to see job titles like DevOps engineer.
Okay.
Because and so this is kind of a roundabout answer to your question, but like the idea being that DevOps was supposed to be more of like a mindset and a methodology than like a role. So the idea that I think you're getting at, that the way, you know, it's kind of the development practices, the way we think about our doing our work is kind of part of what DevOps is that we're moving from kind of a more traditional siloed model of like one team does one part of the application development lifecycle, and then another does another, and to looking at the delivery of software as kind of more of a continuous flowing pipeline of changes. So you know, that it's really the concept of like, I think to me, if I had to say what I think DevOps at its core is, it's that it is that kind of like it's embracing the idea that in a good engineering culture, like change is embraced, and change is a kind of constant. Our organizational and technical processes are geared around how to make change easy and frequent and frictionless, kind of. And that obviously, you know, we'll get into that, you know, especially in businesses that are regulated, the idea of like frictionless, free-flowing change is a challenge.
Right.
You know, yeah. So, but I think the reason why it's of interest, and the reason, you know, to your kind of getting back to your, you know, why is this not a fringe thing, is because of the business value. Because in the end, I think what people have found is that you know, companies, organizations that are able to successfully kind of unlock that more free-flowing change model are just more effective, more successful. So like, you know, I think like, you know, these are older, you know, early, you know, like when WhatsApp got bought for however many billions it got bought for, you know, and it had like 30 employees. Well, what did they do? How were they managing change in their infrastructure to kind of allow them to scale up to that kind of,
right?
Or I think another,
or Netflix, right? Isn't Netflix one of the classic examples? I mean, how many containers were they like? Did they push out a day? I mean, it's like some staggering number, right?
Yeah, I mean, Netflix is I think they very early kind of just made it an internal practice to kind of invest in operational excellence and kind of in using the cloud to its fullest. And they clearly have a culture of kind of, their culture is, you know, I think there's a couple of things going on there. It's DevOps, and then it's also spending a ton of their own resources on tools. So they've which is a real challenge, right? So if you can apply, if you have this DevOps mentality, and you are now trying to figure out how do I kind of embrace free-flowing constant change in a kind of, you know, in a way that makes sense for my organization, you have to start to invest in tooling to support that. You know, companies like Netflix can afford to create kind of huge organizations internally, you know, or like Google, you know, to kind of build the tooling to support that kind of DevOps approach in ways that kind of perfectly match their organization. I think, you know, if you're not Netflix or Google, and you're, you know, you then can kind of run into the challenges of like, well, you know, you want to apply their approaches to your business, but you can't necessarily, you know, have a team of 20 engineers building tools for you in the same way. So you try to use the cloud, you try to use the services from the cloud, or you try to use services that, like Netflix open sources, for example, to kind of replicate a little bit of what they're doing.
Gotcha. So I liked what you said there, and would this be fair to say is that, you know, DevOps is is the way you aspire to operational excellence, right? By creating these repeatable, enforceable processes, right? We can ensure not only that we've got effective change, right? The ability to effectively manage change, but we can do so in a way that, to what you guys do at SimOps, that does it in a way that ensures the security of the application, right, and ensures that the application, maintains compliance with any of the regs that refer to it, or any of the requirements that we've specified. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the DevOps thought leadership really where those folks took their inspiration from is like Toyota, like the Toyota production system.
Yeah. So it's almost like a Six Sigma, it's almost like in a weird way. Is that a fair thing to look at it as well? It's almost like a quality management concept overlaid to development and deployment.
Absolutely. Yes. I think absolutely. Cool. It's about, that's in the, again, why is it not on the fringe? Because it makes too people,
much sense.
well, it makes sense, but it's that it makes value, right? It makes things better quality. It makes companies successful. So it's like, it's not about, I think it makes people happy when you're working in that kind of environment, but ultimately it's a bottom line play. I mean, it actually makes companies more effective.
All right. So do me a favor, unravel some of the, the key, pieces or concepts that, people have probably heard these, they might be buzzwords, then they might be terms they're kind of familiar with. I mean, you hear Agile and you hear workflows and you hear, cloud deployment and Git and Jira. Talk a little bit about like, what does DevOps look like at a high level? What are some of the big pieces? How does it all fit together?
Yeah, I think from a, so if you say, well, okay, what we're really trying to do here is figure out how do we kind of make a more a fluid change management process for our organization. Well, then you start to think about, well, what are some of the tools that we're going to need to help us do that? Well, we're going, you mentioned Jira, I guess. You're going to need to have, do you have the right visibility into kind of what is the stream of work that's happening on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, so that you can kind of understand both what you're planning to do this week and what you've delivered this week. If you're, organizations now will routinely deploy, daily, hourly, or it's certainly like weekly. Well, how do you, if you're going to do that but still kind of need to have a quality and change control process in place? Well, how do you know what you deployed this week? What do you have so you start to think about the kind of tooling that you need to support that more dynamic situation.
So is that like would Jira be kind of analogous to like a project management tool for this process, or how would you describe it in more layman's terms?
Well, I think Jira would be a tool, yes, for project management. For Jira has, I think the reason that Jira has so much popularity is that you can kind of you can configure it in a lot of different ways, and you can integrate it with a ton of different tools. So if you're trying to kind of manage a project, but you're like, man, how do I track all the work that my team did this week? Well, Jira will have plugins to integrate with all the other different kind of quality and development systems that exist. So you can kind of, wire, network together your tooling to kind of get visibility, at the right granularity to how your teams are functioning.
Gotcha.
And you mentioned Git, so like that would be, Git, which is a way to manage your source code. Git would integrate with Jira, but I think certainly another kind of buzzword piece of the DevOps angle here is the idea that all the operational code and configuration for your software, that should be managed as software artifacts in the same way that the application, that your users are clicking around in, they should be managed using the same processes and tools. System administrators, and operational people for years, they wrote code, they wrote scripts, which were, scripting was maybe not, it was considered like a different thing than, I guess, quote unquote engineering or kind of coding in, I guess higher order languages like Java or Python or something. But the reality is that's, I think, part of the DevOps mindset is kind of realizing, well, that stuff, that's software engineering too.
Right. Needs the same level of version control, source code control that the conventional application code does. Correct.
Well, and especially in a cloud world where like the hardware itself is all actually software, right? So,
Cool.
so
Exactly.
right?
That's true.
So yeah.
So real quick for you. So real quick for you there, because the code that we're talking about, these scripts,
Yeah.
right? This is the code that does what? It deploys, let's say, server instances. It deploys contain. Talk a little bit about when you talk about that code. What is that code actually, doing? Right? It's actually deploying what and deploying what where.
Yeah, I would say there's a few aspects of it. There's deployment. So deployment is like when you're building a software system, you build artifacts, which are an executable, an exe file, or in a Windows environment, or like a Java archive or some sort of software package that needs to then get copied onto literally that file. A lot of times another way to reduce DevOps is that DevOps is a process of copying files. So it's just the art of copying files to different places in repeatable ways.
In a controllable way.
So deployment is, okay, I got my new version of my software. I need to copy that file onto my existing servers or onto new servers. Make sure it start it up. Make sure it's running okay, and if it's running okay, well, start to take down the old version of that software. So, the most simple version of that, let's say if you have a system that can support downtime, well, you just shut everything down. You say your team, the site is down for maintenance. You copy the new files on. You start it up again, right? And that would be the most simple way to deploy software. I think most users and companies now don't, they expect system maintenance to be a rare, or a special occurrence. So, typically now teams, you wouldn't do that. You would use your cloud, kind of the fungibility of the cloud in a couple of different ways. Like you might say, well, all right, we got a new version. Well, we'll just copy all of our infrastructure over to some new copies of all of our servers, and we'll copy the new application code to the new servers. We'll make sure it all is running okay, and then we can kind of point our website, our URLs to the new stuff instead of the old stuff, right? So that's something you can there's kind of different flavors of that. Like you can not actually create new servers. You can kind of reuse some of your existing servers, and just copy files to some of those new servers, make sure things are working there, and people have invested a huge amount of time and sophistication in kind of lots of different versions of what I'm describing, meaning like, if you have a website with hundreds of, if you have a very scalable service, maybe you have hundreds of servers running code, your application code, and you actually, when you do deployments, you have a very sophisticated kind of rollout mechanisms. You go to five of those servers if you don't see any, and then you have monitoring systems in place to see, okay, if I don't see errors from those 5 systems, then I deploy to 5 more. But so what I'm talking about there, that's the kind of stuff that like a Netflix is doing,
right?
Where again, you can imagine, well, the team, the sophistication in the teams to build that software, those are products in of themselves, right? Like system that can, in a sophisticated way, roll out a new application to hundreds of nodes with kind of anomaly and error rate detection to decide when to roll back and not. Like, this is where the actual complexity of the tooling you build to manage your application can be just as complicated as the application,
or more complicated, really. So what you're saying is that through this DevOps process, I'm dynamically allocating all of the cloud resources that I need in a logical way that aligns with what I'm trying to accomplish, in a fully, potentially fully automated way.
Yeah, and I mean, we've talked a little bit here about deployment. So like deploying, and which is which makes sense. It's like the first thing to think about is like, how do I get a new version of my software deployed? But in fact, like the kind of the code that people write is not just the code around deploying the software. It actually is the code to kind of define your infrastructure itself. So back to the fact that hardware is now software for most people. If you're working in the cloud, like when you define your network and you define your server instances themselves and the all the your
firewalls, web application firewalls. Yeah, everything is dynamically generated at this point, correct?
So there's a variety of different tools you can use to kind of define all those components in various configuration languages, and basically you can manage those configurations in source control in like a GitHub or a Git in the same way that you're managing the source code for your application features. So that's a really important aspect of this too, is that now you have this opportunity to kind of if somebody wants to add a new internal network subnet, you can kind of review that change and deploy that change in the same way that somebody who's like adding a new tab to your homepage. Yep. So it's deploying the software that your people that customers are using, and then it's actually defining and deploying the kind of underlying infrastructure that all of your services are running on. So that's
right. It's almost as if you're via software, deploying everything from the actual application code itself up through the server, through the network that it sits on, through the virtual data center that it's sitting in, through the network infrastructure and security architecture that's supporting it or protecting it, all in an automated way.
Yeah, I mean, and it's extremely powerful, but it creates a lot of complexity as well. Like
amazing amount of complexity.
So because each of these, because it's not like
I mean, if we layered containers into the conversation, it gets even more crazy, because it almost feels like what was that movie Inception? Where there's the dream within the dream within the dream. I almost feel like when I talk with people about containers, it feels a little bit Inception-ish.
I think that's a really good way to think about it, because what happened with containers is like, so okay, we have the clouds, and the clouds have ways to define your virtual machines and all these different network components that I'm talking about. And then containers are kind of, to your point, it's another layer on top of the clouds that kind of lets you define your infrastructure in yet another way that is, arguably a little bit more portable, in that it's not dependent on a specific cloud. Like you don't necessarily depend on specific Amazon features or specific Google Cloud features. It also, some of these container technologies like Google and others, have released a bunch of tooling around managing containers to get into like the features I'm talking about with deployments in terms of the sophisticated rollouts and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of tooling around supporting those. But on the flip side, what's happened is that now, as an operator, you have to think about both your AWS or your GCP layer of infrastructure.
I'm sorry, what GCP?
Oh, sorry, your Google Cloud layer or your Amazon layer.
Just want to make, I think most people recognize EC2. The GCP is one of those ones I don't know that everyone would recognize.
So like you still have to manage your cloud layer, but now you have a whole new layer on top of that, which is supposed to be, has all the bells and whistles, but yet is all of the same challenges of kind of infrastructure management are now at this container level. In addition to, it's additive. It doesn't necessarily remove complexity for you. It's another layer for your engineering and your ops teams to think about, which is like, how do I kind of manage the configuration and operation of this container layer in addition to my cloud layers, which are sitting underneath it.
Right.
Now, I mean, I think the cloud people would say, well, there's a vision, like Google, all the clouds have kind of container management as a service. So the idea being, well, look, you don't have to worry about any of those details anymore. You can just deploy your containers into our environment and not have to think about any of this complexity. But in my experience is that like most people don't have that clean. Most people inevitably find reasons for their business, for their legacy applications, or for specific features that they need, where they kind of have to go outside of the bounds of like what the predefined containers as a service that the cloud providers offer, can deliver. And so you end up having to think about not just the container layer, but these other layers beneath it.
Yeah. Okay. So quick question for you. So Agile.
Yeah.
First off, what is Agile, right? What are the basic concepts of Agile? And second, you always hear Agile. Well, I shouldn't say you always, but Agile seems to be inexorably linked to DevOps. Does it need to be? Is that just the nature of?
Yeah.
Is Agile one of the drivers to DevOps?
Well, I think in as much as I think if you think of what the goal of, to me, the goal of Agile, and the Agile process is comes from similar motivations to how I tried to frame DevOps as this thing, about a kind of more of a continual fluid change model.
Right.
And and Agile similarly, I think it didn't come from the technical operations side. It came from the kind of more of the how do we manage our engineering process side. But the idea with Agile being like, you should create a culture where you have, smaller, more manageable iterations of work, and a culture where you share that work and test that work with customers, early and often. I think most people have been part of software projects where it's easy to kind of put your head in the sand and you're behind, you want to get stuff done, you spend months and months building some software, and then you release it, and like people are like, well, I don't want to, this doesn't meet my requirements anymore, or I don't like using this. And I think, certainly, and I think Agile was an attempt to kind of inject more reasonable kind of iterative methodologies into the way we think about software. So like, let's not put all our hopes around like testing something with customers in 2 years. How do we kind of plan out our work so that we can get value to customers in a short amount of time, and in a few weeks, or a few months? And how do we kind of recognize the fact that like we might think we know the requirements of our system now, but the reality is that like in 2 months, like we'll have talked to 10 new customers, and like we'll have realized, oh, well, that wasn't a good idea, or we actually have to do this other thing, or like, and we don't want to be locked into a plan where we can't now react to those requirements for months on end. So to me, the reason that these concepts are linked is that it's a similar, Agile was reacting to a similar need to kind of figure out how do we be more fluid, how do we create a process that kind of embraces more continual repeated change than maybe a traditional software development methodology.
Gotcha. So in a weird way, right, Agile drove this idea of this, these faster cycles, the ability to manage change more effectively, which drove this need for operations to adapt to that, which in a weird way drove DevOps a bit, it sounds like.
I think that's true. I mean, I think that is true for sure, because like I remember the first time, the first cloud migration I did was a situation where I was working with a team at my company's internal data center, where the process for years had been like, well, if you needed new software, you'd fill out a spreadsheet. I mean, new hardware, you'd fill out a spreadsheet, and you'd say, okay, I need, here's, and you'd get it in the CapEx budget for next year. Like, here's the components I need. Here's how much storage these servers are going to need, and then you would give them kind of you'd work with them to schedule deployments, and it's like you'd get, somebody from the IT team to be in the data center to kind of help you get your stuff deployed, and it was a big deal to change it. Like, you had to get their time, oftentimes in an off hours, because there weren't necessarily processes in place to kind of do rolling fast deploys. So you'd have to get somebody to kind of be available off hours to do a deployment, and that was really stressful for everybody. And then as our team started to adopt kind of more dynamic software development lifecycle, and we were now trying to do deploys like, initially it was like once a month, but they, that was really tough on the IT team. That was like, that's a lot of off hours time for them if, a bunch of teams are doing deploys that often. And then once a week, what happens when there's a bug? Oh, there's a hotfix process. Well, let's get the hotfix team in place, and we'll get a review process for that hotfix. And it became kind of unsustainable. And then I think at the same time, that's also, as I mentioned, that was one of the same time cloud became, this viable option where engineering teams could be like, well, I could just kind of program my way out of this. If I can securely define and create my infrastructure in, the AWS cloud, or, in a VMware stack or something, then I can run this process. I can deploy when I need to. I can do the quality checks. I don't need to have IT kind of come in and do an off hours deploy for me. So yeah, they're definitely linked.
So these things, yeah, it sounds like all of these things all happened as either some combination of a logical consequence of each other, or arrived at the same time to enable them, right? Because I do think you're right. I mean, would DevOps truly be possible without new cloud technologies? The answer is probably no, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I guess you could, but it's certainly significantly enabled and simplified by, Amazon, AWS, and Azure and GCP.
I think so, not because that on-prem couldn't do it, but there wasn't necessarily the business, like the clouds, they had to provide developers with these interfaces. They were financially if you were running the data center, there was no real incentive for you.
That's right.
But now there is, so now I think there's a whole industry around
creating almost private clouds with the same kind of capabilities. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So in this brave new world, right? Where would you say, what are the key skill sets, right, in the DevOps world? Is it knowledge of the clouds, whichever, so if I'm running a company, it's a SaaS organization. I know we're moving towards DevOps, and I need to make sure I'm hiring the right people. What's the key skill set? Is it knowledge of the cloud that I'm going into? What?
I think there's a couple of things that knowledge of the clouds. There is, in particular with Amazon, it's getting to the point where there are so many services. It is a little bit like
it's overwhelming. If you go into Amazon, it's absolutely overwhelming.
There is almost this need, certainly when you get to a certain footprint of deployment, you do need people that just kind of know that vocabulary, who can kind of spout off all those acronyms and kind of know what makes sense, because there is a lot of real estate there. I mean, and the other clouds are catching up, but there is some value in just people that kind of know that landscape. From an application development perspective, I mean, something that I found really that I kind of learned the hard way was that I have an engineer, I was an enterprise Java developer for a long time. I did not come into the DevOps space from the operations side. I kind of came into it by accident, really, from the development side. And I've always really enjoyed programming infrastructure, working with all these operational challenges. And one of the first opportunities I had to lead a team, I started to build a bunch of tools to help. I was trying to help an organization manage Chef, which is an infrastructure automation tool, and I created all these tools and READMEs and documents, and here's how you can do this in Chef, here's how you can do that. And what I realized is a lot of developers just don't like that stuff. They will not. They were waiting for me or my team. They're like, well, there still remains, even though DevOps require, there's a little bit of there's a engineering skill set is required. Not every engineer, just like not every engineer likes to do front end development or back end development. Like not every engineer is going to like working on those infrastructure and operational problems. So that was something I that I think it should have been obvious to me at the time, but like I had kind of to learn that like part of it is that you can't just hire people that are good software engineers, who have maybe developed great web applications or developed, sophisticated algorithms and kind of say, okay, well, now you can apply your skill set to these operational problems, because not everybody really, that doesn't necessarily resonate with all people. You need to find people that like the, that have some of that engineering aptitude, but that there's hints in their background that they've been the ones on their team that kind of like, they're the ones that built the internal tool to get, the rest of the team, unblocked. They're the ones that kind of like were kind of really, I was so frustrated with our, having to do these manual patch meetings every month. So I wrote this script to kind of automate patching. You have to find people that have kind of been those kinds of engineers on teams, those people that kind of get in there and kind of like, maybe they're a little OCD about how infrastructure gets managed, and they've been the ones to kind of build those tools before. So you can kind of find hints in people's backgrounds about that stuff.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, it's somebody that gets jazzed and excited by that component of the development, right? Because it's dozens of different skill sets, through that whole life cycle. So where does security fit into this, right? You hear this term SecDevOps. Where does that fit in?
Well, I think that a lot of it tied into the, we've been talking a bunch about complexity, and you get into the, now, okay, so now we're in a world where, our networks themselves, the actual, the network routing tables and, are defined in code, and our applications obviously are defined in code, but the ways they connect to each other, the way code gets deployed, you got the container level, the cloud level, you got so many layers upon layers of software that go into, kind of a modern application deployment. Reasoning about the kind of system boundaries and who can do what, and kind of who has access to what, reasoning, properly kind of logging and monitoring, across that complex stack, that has just become more challenging. So I think SecDevOps has emerged as like, okay, we need people. So we already talked about how it's kind of challenging to find people that are, you have to find people that kind of like working on tooling and that kind of stuff. Now we need to find people that are also going to maybe have a mindset where they're kind of thinking about, in particular, the parts of this infrastructure stack that can maybe will put an organization at risk. The one you hear the most about, I feel like, is there's, and for Amazon at least, is access to S3, access to resources in S3. So
yeah, S3 buckets are definitely a challenge. I mean, and they shouldn't be, but I mean, it's remarkable how often they are.
But I think the reason they are is because, look, in the end, software business, like the software does need to connect to the outside world, like to deliver value. So something has to read something from S3 in order. In other words, the most secure business just doesn't run. So right. So the reason that it's not like a solved problem is that like there's a ton of value in storing and getting resources from S3. You can't just, so like if it was as simple as just shutting it off, then there are so much software relies on data stored in S3, and you need to always be thinking about, there's Amazon has now made it, they've gone as far as like at your account level, you can just check a box to say nothing from the outside can access this S3 bucket. Okay, but now there's all these
you just broke everything, right? You just broke the application's functionality.
Yeah. But okay, let's say then you fix all that, but you still have servers that, now the next vector of attack is, okay, well, we can just get onto how do we get onto some instance running? And I think there was a Capital One breach a few years ago, which was it wasn't direct to S3. It was they got onto a virtual machine that could connect to S3, so they were able to and then so you have to. And I think the sophisticated and complex nature of the networks makes it just really hard to reason about and really hard to kind of detect all the different kind of potential access patterns where people cannot get access to these sensitive resources. So
yeah, it's an interesting challenge. And like when you think of DevSecOps, do you think of DevSecOps as being like in my mind I've got this I'm going to call it, and you might disagree with me, a secure development lifecycle methodology, right? That in my mind goes from, code inception, application planning, all the way through, continuous deployment, right? So do you think of DevSecOps as being just the parts of that? Like, so as an example, if I said that you were going to, do unit code security testing. Do you consider that part of DevSecOps, or do you consider that to be kind of further upstream from DevSecOps in a more traditional SDLC?
I mean, I think that if you think about anything where you're developing tools as part of that lifecycle that kind of have a security focus, feel like to me they'd fit into that bucket. I think something that comes to mind for me, I think a lot of people have developed tools to try to help engineering teams understand cloud permissions models. If you're trying to develop a service and you want to make sure you give it the least privilege, how do I properly configure and define my new application so that I'm only giving it the minimum amount of privileges it needs to run in a cloud. So people have done a work, that'd be an example of where DevSecOps can come in with maybe tooling and support around, okay, I see that you're working on something that has, new cloud permissions, something that can either kind of review those, help you get those set up correctly, early in the life cycle. That does feel like it's in the purview of DevSecOps, because there's a ton of there's a ton of complexity in kind of properly defining these cloud permissions. So AWS has identity and access management policies are very complex. They're hugely powerful, but it's a discipline in of itself, even within the kind of DevOps space, of just kind of understanding these policies, their capabilities, how to define them correctly. So I think people that can organizations that are able to kind of move the definition, move it for as early as they can in the development of software, considerations around security policies, are setting themselves up for success. Otherwise, you end up, when you get to the point where you're like, all right, let's deploy this to production. Well, nothing works, because I don't know, we developed it in staging where everything had admin permissions. We didn't have to, and then, so that's a pretty typical pain point. And I think there's a huge opportunity for DevSecOps to come in and help with that.
Yeah, and it is, to me it gets blurry. You live in this world every day. I don't. So to me it does get blurry. So would you consider so let's say you're running a workflow, something like Jenkins, and so it would be the DevOps people that would write the scripts that might, after data gets pulled from a code repository, and it's getting prepped for deployment, where it would be run through, let's say a Selenium or something of that nature, some type of security testing tool. So is that an example of where it that is DevSecOps from your perspective? Because it kind of is reaching down into the SDLC a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, if Selenium, I think.
And Selenium might be. I think, and I think Selenium's got some code testing tools, doesn't it?
I think. Yeah. I think. Honestly, I don't. I would say, you could say I think depending on how an organization structures this, right, like the DevOps team, they would have set up the build pipeline that says, okay, when somebody checks something in to Git, that's going to kick off a Jenkins, or that's going to kick off Jenkins jobs that do a bunch of stuff, including just regular tests, regular kind of packaging of the software or whatever. And then I could totally see like, well, the DevSecOps would say, well, we want to add a step to this pipeline that is, we have this, I don't know, we've developed a series of Selenium scripts that, try to, compromise the web app in various ways, something like this. So, yeah, I mean, I think I think you could, that, and depending on the maturity of the organization, that would easily could just be the DevOps team, but that certainly could be something you could say a DevSecOps role would specifically be like, collaborating closely with DevOps who has this whole build and delivery pipeline to kind of insert elements in it that are like security specific. Sure, that could work.
Interesting.
I don't know that the disciplines are so the boundaries between those disciplines are like so are so hard to set right now. I think just in the same way that like in some organizations, like you may not even have like the engineering team might set up that Jenkins job. Like they may not have they may not even have like a separate DevOps resource to do that, or the DevOps resource they deployed Jenkins and they put in a wiki page on here's how you set up your jobs, everybody, and then everybody else has to read that wiki page to configure their own jobs, right? So there's a lot of fluidity, I think, to these roles. I think there's because of the complexity of these cloud deployments, if you can kind of label somebody as like, okay, you're thinking about security throughout the life cycle, that's helpful just because just in the same way it's helpful when you want to make something important, you kind of need to put a person on it, and that's so that is that I guess that's how I think about it.
Yeah, you can see that the way you can see you look at it from a perspective of a person who's lived in that world, and I look at it from the perspective of a security guy, right? Because like we sometimes get bounced around. You got to go talk to that person. You got to go talk to that person. And that's not my job. And like from my perspective, security is everyone's job. And the further I can move, security down that pipeline, right? And the more that I can get, I can minimize the chance that there's going to be a gap, between what this person is doing over here and this person is doing over here, is so that's why I was asking the questions the way that it was. So let me ask a question. So I've been hearing this term recently, reg tech. Does your SimOps, the stuff that you're doing, would that be considered reg tech?
Yeah, I think that actually that makes sense. I think the reason that we started the company was our feeling that I spent several years as the VP of Eng at a health tech startup. One of my co-founders was the CTO of a health tech startup. We both felt like, wow, like there is such an opportunity to bring some of the kind of DevOps principles and mindset, to how we're managing, kind of deploying our software to kind of more of the compliance space. So, the like working in health tech, there's so much that we needed to do to kind of maintain a secure and compliant posture in terms of entitlement reviews, just the quarterly work we had to do to kind of maintain our infrastructure. A lot of these things are workflows that we felt like, well, in the same way that people have invested in, automating more of the way we deploy our infrastructure, the way we, manage testing. We can apply some of these principles to the way we kind of manage our compliance posture overall. So I say, there's definitely a new group of companies that are, we're trying to like, help places when they need to achieve compliance, to actually build into their, build with software and proper tooling kind of into their actual cadence and the life cycle of how they work, and build those workflows right in. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning, our approach is to, we've created an SDK that lets teams define security and compliance workflows, using our templates that, but that kind of match exactly with, the environments that they have in place. So,
give me an example. Give me, just so people can understand what you mean by about security and compliance. Give me an example of like what a workflow template might do, and and I'm assuming, and one other quick thing. So I'm assuming you're also doing this so to simplify an organization's ability to become, SOC 2 attested and maintain that SOC 2 attestation or ISO 27001 or something of that nature, correct?
Yeah. So a good example for us, so a lot of our early examples, they start with kind of access management workflows. So a typical situation in a cloud environment is, because as I mentioned, it can be really challenging to figure out what cloud permissions are required sometimes to manage your infrastructure. What ends up happening is there's a lot of access drift in most organizations in terms of the amount of access that people have to infrastructure. So a typical workflow example for us is having a way for people to dynamically request access to get elevated privileges to do something for some period of time. What we do to kind of turn that into not just like an access management workflow, but in our view, kind of an actual compliance workflow is like, okay, so let's say that I've requested access to some infrastructure, but it's like 2 a.m. Maybe at 2 a.m, if you happen to be on call, like you should be able to get that access to resolve an issue. But that's really not good enough from a compliance. You can't just say at 2 a.m. people can do what they want, right? So what we do is we provide a good way. Well, okay, if somebody gets emergency access, let's make sure we kick off the kind of follow-up workflow. So the next day, there's a proper kind of follow-up and review. What was the emergency access for? Did you have you recorded the proper kind of follow-up actions from that emergency access so that they can be, corrected, in a non-late night way, with the team as needed. And then in addition, we build in the reporting so we actually can kind of see based on actual activity from the clouds. Well, here's what, here are the key systems or components that were touched when this emergency access was requested. So
gotcha. So
there's an initial pain point around, let me get access to this thing, but knowing that what in our experience, that's not enough. We can't just say that, okay, there's a process to get access. How do we show that we kind of have the right kind of controls around that access to really make it fly from a security compliance perspective, which in our view is, do we have the kind of proper review process in place if we do have emergency escalations? Is the proper follow-up in place? Do we have reporting and analytics that are kind of tied to these events, so it makes it easy for my team and for an auditor to see how we're able to correlate workflow activity from access requests to what's actually happening in the clouds. So
you enforce. So it sounds like you enforce policy and procedure and ensure that you've got the artifacts to demonstrate that.
Right, which is kind of what you need that whole package. If you want to go show we have a process in place. Those are all the kind of components in our view that people are going to want to see.
Gotcha. Is it just out of curiosity? Is that done through like the automation server, like the workflows, like Jenkins? Is that done? Is that data stored in Jira, Confluence? Where does that? Where are you shimming in to their systems?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different ways that we do it. The vision with our SDK is that because it's a toolkit, we'll be able to integrate into basically, anything that has an interface that that supports kind of programmatic interaction.
Mm-hmm.
For our early customers, a lot of them, either they're kicking off these workflows in Slack, which is a common. I think it's a common way for teams to be communicating with each other. So they'll kick off a workflow in Slack to request access to something, and then we basically have cloud integrations into customer accounts where basically we have a workflow engine that we host, and then we kind of have a serverless deployment model. So we're able to basically deploy these like small serverless appliances basically into our customer accounts, and those appliances can kind of securely talk to our customers' infrastructure, to kind of interrogate it, to kind of make entitlement changes in customer systems. So like the benefit of this approach is we can kind of own this. We can manage for customers this nice workflow system that they don't have to manage and maintain, but they don't have to kind of give us keys to the castle in order for that system to work.
I gotcha.
So we can have these little appliances that are running where their access keys stay there in their accounts, and they get the benefit of the workflow and reporting and analytics living in our account, meaning the benefit of not having to maintain all that stuff.
Gotcha. Yeah, when that's the problem with these. We're running out of words to use. Like workflow, I'm immediately thinking you're talking like a Jenkins workflow. You're talking about a SimOps workflow.
Yeah, I mean, and then reality is like, we have a customer that's like, we can have a SimOps workflow that will kick off your Jenkins workflow for
exactly, or vice versa. Right.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and just generally speaking, where do people keep the evidence? Like, so at the so if you follow this process, is that going to be? I mean, I guess it could be anywhere, right? It could be a help desk ticket, it could be in Jira, it could be pretty much anywhere because of the fact that you guys are an SDK.
Yeah, so I think we'll see a lot of people will want to ultimately create tickets, in Jira, because a lot of people do have, that is has become a little bit of like a system of record for these things, and then we have our own kind of reporting platform, but to your point, I think we will, using our appliances, basically we can post the kind of final artifacts to the systems that people need.
Cool. Interesting stuff. It's crazy that, 5 years ago, we probably couldn't know whatever the number is. 5 years ago, there wouldn't have been that many people that would be interested in this conversation. And now it's pretty much everywhere. We've had such great conversations, and there is a lot of interest. There's just a lot of people, there even 5 years ago, right? There was friction to, well, what are we doing securely in the cloud versus not, right? Like nobody, I don't feel like people are still, everyone kind of understands that it is possible to run securely in the cloud now. People don't, everyone understands that it's hard and it's challenging. People want help, but it's not like, I don't feel like, we're not having the same conversations about like, is the cloud secure is no longer a conversation. Now I think that it's do we have enough knowledge to use the cloud securely? I think is now the question you need to ask. Right? Does my team have the knowledge? Does my team have the tools, or do I need external support or external tools to be able to make the cloud secure? Because the cloud can be secure. There's no doubt about it. In fact, the cloud arguably can be more secure than your on-prem stuff.
I think you're right, but I think you nailed it. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity. If you're not Netflix and don't have thousands of engineers that you can have investing in your cloud ops platform.
If you're not developing your own container system,
right? So that's that for a lot of engineers,
that's like, how many engineers that they have that they looked at Kubernetes and they looked at Docker and said, "Nah, we'll build our own."
Right. So that's where it's hard to it's amazing what they've done, but for many companies it's not necessarily a model that there's a lot of risk to that model trying to develop yourself.
Oh yeah. But then if you have, whatever it is, 20 million, people giving you, $15 a month, yeah, you can afford to do a lot of fun things.
Yeah.
All right. So is there anything that we didn't touch on that you think we should touch on before we say goodbye?
I think we covered a lot here. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I did too. I learned something, which is always good for me. So we warned you, so I hope you're prepared for this question. So so we usually say an amazing or horrible CISO. I'll say an amazing or horrible, engineering manager or DevOps engineer, whatever. So what fictional character, or real person, do you think would make an amazing or horrible DevOps engineer, and why?
Well, I've been thinking about this. As first of all, I decided to go amazing to keep it positive, and I think we talked about this. I'm kind of a big Celtics fan. So
I like the coach.
I like the coach too. I've been thinking about. I'm going to go with Marcus Smart. I don't know if you're familiar.
I like Marcus Smart.
So
he's a great player.
And so I think he'd be good. And I have a couple of reasons. So
because he's smart, obviously, that's the first one, right?
He is. He's smart, but he is. So first of all, he's a great individual defender. So I guess if I wanted, ultimately, I'd want a CISO or even a dev. I'd want somebody who could do the individual heroics when we needed them. When emergency struck, that he or she would be there for those heroics. But he has a reputation as well for being a great communicator. And I think a lot of a CISO or really in a DevOps job is not just the heroics, but are you able to effectively? I'm sure you, Mr. President, for you, just are you able to effectively communicate to people why it's important for them to do these things, which I think is often a real challenge. That creates so much friction for a lot of this kind of infrastructure work. Like, why do we have to go through this process now? Why do I have to? What is it? So being able to communicate effectively and in a way that people will respond to is really important. And then I think just in terms of he's also a leader, and I think kind of back to the thinking about like how like the deployment tools, sophisticated deployment tools can be more complicated than the application itself. The operations and security I feel like are more and more what is going to differentiate organizations. Like there's a lot of cool features out there. There's a lot of companies doing neat things, but can you do them with operational excellence? It's kind of like so leadership from the ops side, from the security side, I think is has huge value to organizations that everyone. It's not that hard to have a good idea, but it's hard to make that scale.
Yeah, like there's the old adage, a great strategy with with marginal execution, will get trumped by a marginal strategy with great execution every time. So I agree with you. The other thing which I like that you said, and I think is really key here, is that communication I think is so critical because you have such disparate audiences, in the DevOps world, right? You've got the original engineering, the software engineers in the traditional sense, right? You've got DevOps, you've got security sticking their nose in there, and then you've got business leadership, right? Which you need to get their buy-in on all of the stuff. So, I mean, realistically, you need to be able to talk, in multiple languages, to disparate audiences in a way that rallies the troops and gains consensus. And I think that's a hard thing to do. I think that's one of the reasons why, the world that you live in every day is a challenging world to live in.
Yeah, it can feel kind of thankless, honestly, because it's not, if you're doing your job well, like you're not getting a lot of applause, like,
Yeah, it's probably like being an NFL, an NBA ref, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the only time you recognize the NBA ref when he fails to swallow his whistle at the wrong time, right?
Yeah. So, yeah.
All right. So with you, last question, I guess. No, just one quick thing. So farewells. Before we say farewell, how can folks get in touch with you, Jon, if they're wanting to chat with you?
Well, I'm on Twitter. Actually, so first, my Twitter handle is First More Coffee. So back to coffee being so.
It's not Brookline Beans. I mean, I would have thought that would have been your handle because.
No, but that 4A Coffee. That's my place. So I'll give them a shout out.
Now, there you go. I think they're going to be you're going to be looking for a cut on future revenues from them.
Right now, I just really want them to stay in business.
Oh God,
they can keep that right. We need those small businesses.
From your lips to God's ears, that all of these small businesses that are getting killed in this current COVID thing are all healthy and stay in business.
So that's what I think for them. And then SimOps.com is our company website, and you can reach out to us. Jon at SimOps.io. You can always reach out to me there too.
Cool, Jon. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you coming on. I had a lot of fun.
Likewise. Great talking to you.